Join Lucky and I as we go over the 3 phases of mission development for armor players wanting to take their mission making skills to the next level. Later on, we talk about optimizing multiplayer missions, what Zeus can and cannot do, and humbly swap stories of lessons learned. Thanks for tuning in to GETactics Radio. In this episode, we talk about how to approach mission making in Arma 3 and offer mission making strategies that can better prepare you for time spent in the editor. We also include some references for mission making in our description below. Welcome, Lucky.
Hey, glad to be here.
So, as far as approaching mission making, you have 2 main poles which you feel everyone lies on.
Yeah, there are 2 ends of the spectrum for mission making in 2 ways you can approach. On the one hand, you can be super organized and plan everything out and have spreadsheets and flowcharts and graphs and outlines and everything. Very few people do it like that. And at the far other end of the spectrum, you've got the dabblers who just get in the editor and they don't have much of an idea, maybe just a little kernel, and they start exploring. Or, I don't know, I have known people who have big ideas and they get in the editor and start, boom, dive in and start going. That usually doesn't go well. But I do know people who, and I've done it myself, where I start with just a little kernel of an idea and I just start exploring and playing and putting a little something in and kind of build it up in that exploratory way. However, most people who make missions probably are somewhere in between. They're some organization, but there's a lot of back and forth between exploring in the editor and taking their ideas and then refining their ideas. And that's the approach I use generally today, is sort of a middle of the road.
Arma 3 is definitely a great game as far as exploring. There's a whole universe of scripts and mods, any sort of camo objects you want to bring into the mix to plan whatever, make your wildest dreams come true as far as a mission goes, whether it's a community or just for your group of friends. But you have a philosophy as far as game design. Would you like to go through that?
Yeah, and I've been, how many years ago? 40 years ago or so, I started as a dungeon master, making games for friends that way and doing things like that, and through computer games. And I've read a few books on game design, and I want to remember to bring up one little incident from one piece of advice from one earlier at some point. But I would say, as far as Arma mission making, 4 things that I would advise. One is, of course, this is almost doesn't need saying, but if you have a group of players who is your target audience, whether that's just a group of friends or a clan or people who are downloading your missions on the Steam Workshop, orient your content and the experience to your players. Give them the kind of stuff they want. It's kind of obvious, but don't get so wrapped up in one of your own ideas. If you're making it for your clan and your clan loves close quarters door kicking and you get a great idea for a dogfighting mission, well, that's probably not going to go over too well for your clan. The second thing is to balance the challenge, sort of the Goldilocks zone of the amount of challenge. A little too much challenge and it's frustrating. A little too little challenge and it actually gets boring. You want that Goldilocks zone right in the middle that is just the right, and it doesn't have to be constantly at the quote perfect level. It can go back and forth from moment to moment within a mission. So that's an important idea, is to balance that out, and that we'll get to later really needs other players to come in and test it. The third thing I would say is make it a story. Give it emotional highs and lows, both in terms of where the players feel like they're kicking butt, and then times where they're scared for their lives, times where they're the heroes, times where they're the goats. Pacing, you want to have some parts that are a little bit slower, parts that are faster and higher energy, and this, is going to be shaped by the particular mission that you're working on, but that general idea of thinking about the story and the highs and lows of it. And the last thing is always try to work from the player perspective. Try to understand how they're going to experience it, with it, as they say, the user experience. Look at the mission from the user's eyes, from the player's eyes, not just literally, but in terms of what's fun for them, what's boring for them, um, what are the cool parts, what are going to be the memorable parts. You probably can't really predict that too well. Some of them you can. If you build up for a particular, set up a particular event, you might be able to say that, yeah, that's going to be memorable, but a lot of it just unfolds as the players are playing. So that's kind of my overarching philosophy entering into mission making.
So I'm probably like most armor gamers out there. I've dabbled with a few different objects in the editor, maybe reverse engineered things I found out there in the community. Probably even cobbled together working missions, been able to maintain them here and there, adjust settings. How do you recommend I get more organized? I'm looking to take it to the next level, make some missions for my community, maybe take some ideas that they're offering. How do I get my thoughts translated down to paper and turn it into a high quality mission?
That's great questions. How to go from the junior varsity to the varsity. The first big thing I would say is start small. Make a few small missions to get your chops down, to learn some of the basic things. Otherwise, I've seen people get carried away with their big ideas and never finish the mission. So start small. Like a lot of things, you want to start small. And then I would say, I would offer some meta questions to frame the mission that you're going to make. Start by thinking through things like this. Is it co-op or TVT? Is it single player, multiplayer? What level of realism do you want for it? Is it going to be real hardcore and you're going to use AGM with all the settings dialed up, or is it, just total vanilla, no mods? Maybe it's even sort of a fun mission that is a little silly, and because that's what your players want in this case. Also, ask yourself how many players you're making this for. It's a whole different animal to make a mission for 40 players than to make it for 8 players, which is also different than making it for 1 player. How long do you want the mission to last? How long is it going to take players to get through it? You should think, is this roughly an hour? Is it roughly a half an hour? Is it roughly 4 hours? All those things are going to be important, but they're flexible. And then the action or the content of the mission. Is it an attack mission, a defend mission, a stealth mission, a raid mission, advance and secure? Is it a convoy? Is it an ambush of a convoy? Is it some mix of all of the above? And then a philosophical question, are you going to lean more towards an on-rails experience where you strictly dictate what happens for the player or players? Or is this going to be more of a sandbox, open world sort of thing, room for emergent gameplay? Or is it going to be tightly scripted where they must do X and then they must do Y and then they must do Z, and every time people play it, they're going to have the same experience? On the one hand, you're going to dictate the experience to the players, and you can make it really cool by doing that. On the other, you're going to allow more freedom and creativity, but they might not get that super cool experience that you had in mind. So these meta questions are how I suggest you frame the mission as you start to dive into it.
And starting small helps with all of these. You can't simulate how long it's going to take for squad A and B to form some sort of pincer maneuver on an objective. They may all choose to go one route, which happens to be over mountains, taking twice as long as you expected. So you would highly recommend starting small, gaining a lot of experience there, and then building up from there.
Yeah, definitely. It's just, if you're going to make a movie, you don't go from zero experience to making a 2-hour feature film. You start small.
And I imagine that kind of reduces the amount of moving parts, which can fail, the sort of obstacles that can really make a junior mission maker frustrated.
Exactly.
So as far as I'm ready to get organized. I've got some great ideas, maybe spots I've seen in the map that I want to utilize. Got maybe some storylines. You offer three main phases as far as being organized in mission making. These include the planning phase, drafting, and testing and revive phases. So let's start with planning. What does this entail?
This is the part where you're taking your kernel of an idea for the mission and you're developing it up further. You're adding, building on it. Let me give you an example. So you start a brainstorm and you think, I want to have an infantry stealth mission where players have to come in and find some intel and get out without having a lot of encounter. So it's not a lot about shooting. And then maybe you add on that and you say, I'm going to give them some room. I want it to be better done very stealthily. But, if they get a little loud and they start shooting some things, they can probably still get out, but it'll be harder if they do that. And then, okay, let's tease this out further. I'm thinking probably don't want to have to infill to an enemy base. That would be too hard to be stealthy unless you're, super spies. So maybe more like an enemy-controlled town, and I have to get into and out of a particular building in a town that, is hostile, protected by hostiles. And so you keep brainstorming, and I'm thinking maybe that could work on a big open airfield type base, though. So now I've developed my idea a little further and refined it a little bit, and I want to try to get down to a clearer vision for that. You could call it an elevator pitch. So I'm going to refine that all down, and I'm going to say a SEAL team, so it's a single team, 8, 12 guys, must stealthily infill into a hostile military site, find and take intel, and extract safely. So just within that amount of brainstorming, I've refined my idea. At one point I said, no, it can't be a military base. And then I thought a little more about it. I said, well, if it's the right type of military base, maybe it can be. So that's my first phase in getting it to a refined single sentence kind of pitch or concept.
And this elevator pitch is something that can work best as far as summarizing your mission briefing. What's the single line story of this mission and describing it for your players, right?
Yeah, this phase is all about expanding the possibilities and then narrowing it down. So I'm kind of crystallizing. I started with an idea like I want to have a stealth mission to get intel, and now I've refined it and made it a little more specific.
Okay, so part B in phase 1, you're developing the idea. This is where we take those stories, the ideas that you have, and turn them into more technical language for use in the editor?
Right. This is just going to be planning out a little more detail. So some specifics. For example, I could say, I think I'm going to want to have them infill by helo to maybe a kilometer out, and then they're going to have to hike in stealthily from there. Or maybe I'm going to say, I'm only going to give them suppressed weapons and sort of a light or moderate amount of supplies. And I'm going to say they have to find an entrance into the base. They either have to find a hole in a fence, or they have to find an entrance that's not well guarded or something along those lines. I could say, I'm thinking about the enemy base now, so I'm gonna put an MRAP with an HMG patrolling around it, and then I maybe have some foot patrols, and I'm gonna set it up so that if they take the time to recon and look around carefully, they can find a smarter route, so that good players will take the time to do that before just running in. So now I've fleshed it out a little further. I've got some pretty concrete ideas that I'm gonna try.
All right, so all of phase 1 isn't even entering the editor yet. However, diving into phase 2, where we get the editor, you would certainly be a proponent of going between phase 1 and 2 as necessary in order to try ideas.
Yeah, I mean, that's a personal choice kind of thing. I keep lists actually of mission ideas, and every once in a while I go through them, and as soon as I get an idea, I'll write in as much as I have, which is sort of those first phase 1A and phase 1B. And then at some point I'll jump in the editor and begin. Different people will, as I said, want to do more planning, or they'll want to just get in and start working. That's kind of a personal style thing. Personally, for me, the second phase is it's this back and forth kind of thing. I go from the idea into the editor, do some stuff, do little mini tests, see what works, revise it, and I start to add more. Then I test that and I revise it, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that back and forth from idea to revision and testing. So I'm in the editor and I'm putting stuff down and then I'm revising. But a lot of people say, well, I have an idea. Where do I begin? And there really is no perfect answer. Once you get your sort of elevator pitch, your core idea narrowed down a bit and added some detail, I would say get in the editor and start with maybe a central concept to the mission. So, for example, if the players are going to ambush a convoy, test the convoy, set up the convoy, the OP4 or enemy convoy, make sure that it is going to travel the route you want it to travel. If it's AI controlled, because that can get funky, that would be an important thing, a central concept to get in and test. Another example would be if it's crucial that your players are going to halo out of a UH-80, get in and test that. What scripts are you going to use to do that? Do you know how to do that? Do you need a module? But don't just assume that, oh, sure, there's parachutes in the game, there's UH-80s, I can halo at 5,000 meters, that'll be fine. Get in and test those core concepts.
So in phase 2,
go ahead.
It's a sort of a drafting phase. We're building the rough draft, and it's more or less component testing. And in your experience making dozens of missions in Arma 2 and Arma 3, how have you been able to adapt as to hitting roadblocks? Maybe you had tested a certain feature that was almost core to the mission, your story, and did you have to flex beyond that, sort of change it up?
Absolutely. You rarely, you always have problems. It's just a question of how big and deadly they are. So the first, let's go with the convoy idea. If that's my idea and I set a bunch of vehicles down and I give them waypoints and they're moving along, and then they just, I've had this happen, particularly in Arma 2 early on. Some of the vehicles would drive off the road and some would follow the others and some would go into the water and some would get stuck on a building. It was terrible, frankly, early on in Arma 2. That got better later. But at that point, you got to use your resources. And by that, I mean everything from your friends who know more about it to a YouTube tutorial to the Bohemia forums or the Armaholic forums. Maybe the BIS wiki, depending on the kind of thing that you're trying to chase down. You can also look at others' missions, download others' missions and open them up and look under the hood and see, oh, well, here's a mission that has a convoy. How did they do it? Because I remember that one worked and it was pretty good. That reverse engineering is a super valuable approach. The danger there is that you try to pull something out of somebody else's mission and slam it into your mission without really understanding how it works. You can, work yourself into trouble because you really don't know how it works. So, like a mechanic, you want to kind of, if you're going to use it, you got to figure out how to use it and do it right. And here's the thing that took me a long time to learn, and I still don't always remember it. If you hit a dead end, if you hit a really rough spot, and it's hard to know when it really is a dead end and when it's just rough, but at some point you have to cut your losses. You have to say, okay, I really wanted this thing to happen and it ain't happening. And you just simplify, you find a simpler way to do it to, get through the mission. The mechanic that you wanted is too complicated. You require scripts that are over your head, etc. Just move on. Just move on. Just say, I'll come back to that concept at some later mission, but I'm just going to simplify it into a way that will work and go on. And here's the surprise. it probably won't matter that much to your players. I hate to admit that. I can remember a mission that I cooked up the mission in about 4 hours, and I then spent 12 hours trying to get one stupid little thing to happen. And it was, I think I finally got it. No, I didn't get it in that one. And then I remember telling people, well, I wanted this to happen there. And they're like, oh yeah, that'd be nice. But it really didn't matter to them in the end. So that's know when to cut your losses and just simplify and move on.
That's a core facet of moving from that junior varsity to the varsity stage. Being able to be efficient in mission making, because as you sort of introduced this topic, you mentioned people who had these grand ideas and they weren't able to execute with them. And not only does a mission fail to be delivered to a community and you don't have anything to play, you're not going to learn from those experiences. So learning, starting small is definitely a key thing. And you're right, keeping the player's experience in mind is the best way to go. You may have a set number of hours that your practice takes, and a certain component working or not. If it's gonna be a real epic experience for the players, and it has to work. They've never done anything like this in a mission before. Then that's maybe something you spend a little bit more time on. But certainly, if it's an issue of transport or some other thing, you would certainly agree there's workarounds for almost nearly everything.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, if you a classic is like you want to have a certain piece of intel that players have to find, and then it gets very sticky. And Arma 3 adds some nice little ways to deal with this. It's the interactive intel, they call it. But can they pick it up? Can they pick this intel up? What happens when they pick it up? Can they store it in their inventory? Can they give it to another player? Blah blah blah. Or is it something that is it really important to your mission? You have to say, if something is too complicated, it's just killing you to get it to work. Just simplify it, and instead of having to find a document in a building, just set a trigger so that when somebody walks in there, a message pops up and gives them the intel. Just simplify.
It's almost a balance of realism, from the player's perspective, and every community is going to be a little bit different in how they approach that actual that piece. But for realism's sake, yeah, being the most real as possible. If that's going to take 15 minutes for players to execute on the field, that's something that's not going to be entertaining in the long haul.
Yeah, it's, again, you go back to thinking about the player's perspective. If I'm in the game and I'm doing this thing, what's going to be fun for me? What's going to be boring? What's going to be challenging but pay off in the end? All those kinds of things.
All right, so in the drafting phase, we did some component testing. I was able to take different ideas that I had, ensure that they worked. I've started to integrate many of those ideas, and you're a big advocate for bringing in playtesters early on, right?
Right. So I would say that phase 3 is as soon as possible, as soon as you have a mission that's at all playable, even if only part of it is playable. And I've done this, like for a mission that's going to take an hour and a half, I've taken a section that's going to be maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and that's really, kind of high concept or tricky or something, or I want to see if the players just plain find it fun. So as soon as possible, get some other people into test. And I read this book on game design, and this guy said, he was a game designer, he says he always allots however much time he has to make a game, 20% of the way through he wants to have players in, because his quote was something like, nothing means anything until the players get their hands on it. And I remember reading that and thinking, well, I don't know. I think I can design pretty well. I can predict pretty well what's going to happen when the players get in. But sure enough, a lot of times I can't predict. I think I have a lot of experience and I think I know my players, and I can't predict. So get them in, and they're going to help. They're going to see things just plain differently. They're going to approach things differently. They're going to have a different perspective than you've been assuming. You kind of, when you're designing something, you often get locked into, oh, well, it's this stealth mission and they're going to come up the river in the boats and then they're going to get to point A and they're going to disembark. Well, Players, they jump in and they're like, oh no, we're disembarking a click before point A, and then we're going to hike in from there because blah, blah, blah. And you're like, ah. So get the players in early and save yourself a little trouble. They will also find problems. They will find things that are broken because when you're testing it yourself, that component testing, you're doing the same thing over and over again with a certain assumption, but they will come in and find broken things for you. And maybe most of all, they're going to be able to tell you what's fun and what's boring and what is okay, but it was too, gee, there weren't enough enemies there, or gee, that was an awfully long hike that we had to do to get to the objective, or all those kinds of things.
And one of our strategies of using playtesters earlier on is bringing in platoon leaders and squad leaders. This can not only get your veteran members looking at the mission, but also giving them, a little bit of a heads up, pre-brief as far as what's going to happen, getting in on the map, and that will help them generate some better plans when it actually comes time for 0 hour. And that way you're also not spoiling the story or certain exciting components you may have built into the mission with your general community members. So we're in phase 3. We're bringing on the playtesters. Creating the briefing is something that's going to be refined throughout the whole process. Can you weigh in on how important the briefing is to one of your missions and the entertainment factor?
Again, this really depends on your audience. Who are the players? What do they expect? What are they going to find fun? What are they going to find too much detail? A friend of mine is a tank battalion XO in the U.S. Army, and he gave me an operational order that he drafted for a training operation they did, and it's really cool, but it's way too much detail for just about any gamer I know. I've adapted that and starting to use it with a group that I play with in a simplified sort of version, which interestingly somebody told me about 4 years ago. They're like, yeah, why don't you try this 5-paragraph briefing approach? And I looked at it then and didn't like it, but now my group is a little more realism oriented, so I think they'll like it. But the key is just, what's the information they should have going in, from logistics about Arma and the game and mods and revive and things like that, join in progress, medical, all those kinds of things, to gear that they're going to, be able to use, intel on the enemy, whatever works for your group. Give them something so that they're not just stepping in totally blind, but don't bore them with too much so they're just not even going to read it, which I've had happen.
So we're interested in making a mission that's a bit more organized. We've gone through phase 1 planning, phase 2 drafting, and we're in phase 3 for testing and revising. Speak to just how many times you have to test beyond the component level. How many hiccups that you might find. I want to say like the enemy gets a vote here, but how many things that you've almost felt are certain and you have to still test them over and over again, or even adapt beyond that, and leading into the clay and building it up from the small start that you might have started, kind of evolving over time.
Yeah, there's no easy answer, obviously. It's as long as it takes to get the mission smoothed out enough so that the players will enjoy it. You want to add cool details, but you don't want to overburden it. You want to get your details working well. They don't need to work perfectly. I've always been in favor of producing a lot of missions that were good rather than trying to produce a few missions that were perfect. And that's worked pretty well for me and for my group. So there's no I would say it's never done. It's done at the alpha stage, and then you get people to come in and test, and you revise, and you improve, and you get it up to the beta stage, and then you get a big test, and you do, beta stage, everything's almost done and almost perfect, and the big picture is definitely there, and you get some feedback on that and you revise. And that's going to include things like not just what's broken. Usually you're going to get things fixed that were broken from the alpha stage, but in the beta stage you're going to start to add a little more polish and detail, like um, about what's fun and what's boring and what's unnecessary and what could improve things, stuff like that. And you're always trying to keep the players in mind, but when you get a bunch of players in and they're playing it, that's going to help you know what their perspective is. Then, you get to your release level, your release candidate in the software world term, and you put it out there and you run it. Maybe for my group, that means we play it in one of our mandatory practices, and then I make notes on what do I want to change for the next time around. And I've got change logs on my briefings that, might have 6 or 7 iterations and improvements and changes and updates that go along based on, what happened the last time we ran it.
All right, so as I evolve as a mission maker, I've heard about this Zeus thing. What are the things I can and cannot do with Zeus? The sort of game modes and best practices you would use that in an environment?
That's a good question. The Zeus system that Bohemia added in Arma 3 opens up a lot of cool options. A lot of cool stuff can be done. Being a game master, I think they use that term, is an art form in itself. What you can't do is, you can't easily do anyway, you can't create a mission using Zeus as an editor and then save it and then play it later. Basically, Zeus is about real-time spawning, creating everything from units, from foot mobiles to vehicles to an artillery battery or a airstrike, and things like objectives. It can be a really useful tool, but for somebody to be a good game master with Zeus, they have to practice it a lot. It's kind of, like playing a violin. You don't just pick it up and start playing cool music.
Okay, so as Arma 3 develops over time, becomes a bit more sophisticated, which enables you to do more, a bit more optimized over time, what are the things that you sort of can and cannot do with scripting? Can you even make missions that are optimized or as powerful as other missions if you know how to script or not?
One of the things that I love the most about the Arma mission editing functions is that you don't have to know any scripting. You can make missions with 0 scripting. And then you can start putting just a couple words in, a couple little words here and there. And if count is greater than or equal to 3, then something happens. Just little things you can start to do. And then it's baby steps. You add one more step and now you're using a whole line of code. And then, now I'm calling this little 4-line thing of code that I found somewhere. And then you're writing your own scripts, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful environment to start to learn to do some serious coding, but you don't have to. If I like coding, so it's been fun for me to build my coding skills further. Some people want no part of it, and I don't know if you're one of them. You don't need the coding, especially with Arma 3's modules. They add a whole bunch of functionality that's drag and drop, and just click a few radio buttons and maybe enter a few numbers or terms here or there. So the bottom line for scripting is you don't need any. You can learn it slowly in this nice baby step way, and once you start to learn it, you'll start to feel the power of scripting and how much you can do with it. And I think it's really addictive. Like, wow, I made that happen. That's amazing. That's so cool. And Arma's a good environment for learning to do that and to doing it, growing your skills.
All right, on the topic of optimizing for a multiplayer server, what are the things that you keep in mind as a veteran mission maker as far as server performance goes, locality, as you scale up to maybe go from squad missions to entire platoons and battalions? Are there certain ideas which are things those looking to go from, the junior varsity level should keep away from as far as, the starting small?
Yeah. Now, keep in mind, if you're making a mission for you and 3 of your friends, you can get away with a lot. You can put probably a couple hundred AI on the map and, hundreds of vehicles or something, and it probably won't be a problem. But if you're making a mission for a dozen players or 20 or 40, particularly for 40, you definitely want to try to help the server not explode. So the main thing to consider is how many AI units you have on the map at a given moment. And there's no simple number. It depends on the server that's running it and the scripts that are running on it and some other things. But personally, I don't know if this works for other people. Lately, in the last few months, in the second half of 2014, I would say, BIS has done some optimization that at first looked bad, but now it's looking better. And I can have a mission for 36 players and have 125, 150 AI on the map. 150 is pushing it. 125 is a better limit at once. That doesn't mean that's all you can ever have, because you can start with 125, and then as some of them get killed off, later in the mission, you can spawn in others. So that's the number one thing, is the number of AI. Number two, distant second, is vehicles. Because of the PhysX computations that have to be made for vehicles, particularly vehicles, also for a lot of other objects that have physics properties that can be bounced around and things, you don't want to have a ton of them on the map. The only time where I've really seen that be a problem is where people build up a base or something where they're putting literally 1,000 objects around, HESCO barriers and who knows what, and they've got so many objects that it's just going to lag the server out that way. Otherwise, I would say beyond that, you get into complicated stuff. Locality is a complicated thing to discuss. No easy way to explain it clearly, but if I'll throw one sentence in. Locality is about where an object or a variable exists in terms of, is it on the server, is it on the client, is it on all the clients, is it on both the server and the clients? It's complicated. I remember being really befuddled when I was starting to edit Arma 2 missions, and I posted on the Bohemia forums and said, can somebody just explain to me simply a couple do's and don'ts about locality? And there was this sort of silence, and then some veteran guy generously wrote in and he said, look, it's just complicated, and you can't boil it down to do X, Y, and Z, do not do A, B, and C. It's too complicated for that.
Can't even understand it. There's just like unwritten rules, like guidelines. Kind of pausing a bit, I'm going to ask you about famous mistakes, other times you've been befuddled.
So my big example of failing to follow my own advice and keeping things within the limits of my ability and my understanding was back when I created the Mega Mission, which you remember playing,
right?
Which ended up being fun, but I said the deal was, okay, let's make a 5-hour mission. Wouldn't that be fun? Let's get a group of people together and we'll have tons of intel, and we'll have a month of let the players plan what they're going to do, and we'll give them all this cool intel, like a SEAL team or a Delta team would, get an intel dump, and they'll have to look through it and find out what's significant. Well,
there was video flyover of UAVs, which gave you different angles of maybe a mountaintop compound, and the squads would subsequently begin to identify different areas that they could maneuver in and around fences and things of that nature. So this mission, not only was the intel dump, as you mentioned, was carried out over several weeks. The mission itself, I think, began at some 10 a.m., at least my time, and which started with some good coffee. But we had this thing lasted so long. You had to pause for bathroom breaks, and you tried to do this during strategic, transport periods, right?
Yeah, it was fun. And remember, we had people in California and people in Germany playing, and everywhere in between. So it was really challenging. It started really early for me in California. But the problem, what happened, looking back, and we got done, people said nice things, but I was unhappy, and I said that I had said that we would run it again, but then I just felt like it wasn't good enough to run again. It was so broken. So many things were broken. And why were they broken? Because I tried to do too much. I went way over my head. And initially, you will remember, we were supposed to run it on a given day. My co-game master and I were up all night trying to finish it. Didn't get it done in time. We said, we'll try again in a month. And that's when we finally ran it. But when we finally did run it, it's embarrassing how far out of my league I reached on that one. And I think today I could go back and make a 5-hour mission for 24 people that would work and be cool. But I'm not sure that the payoff is worth the effort.
And reaching beyond your means at the time, nearly ruined what otherwise was a great idea for a mission. And had workarounds been developed for certain complex areas, or you had left in more time for testing, possibly. I don't want to speak for what your process was back then and how you've evolved since, but the idea itself could be sound, and working in a certain component or trying to do a certain element of a mission may have to be something you put off, and you bring in another mission. That's the whole spectrum's a bad word there, but that's the whole path of evolution, sort of, in growing, and everyone starts somewhere.
Yes. Let me throw in my classic mistake as a mission maker is that I will...
I think I know what it is.
Yeah, you do. We should get the picture of my last Arma 2 mission. So I've learned fairly early that there are times where you want to spawn in enemy AI units, AI controlled units, in a co-op mission, this is at least. And whether that's because they were inside a building and boom, you want to spawn them as they, come out of the building supposedly, or whether, it's just a later segment of the mission and you can't have all the units on the map at once because that would overload the server. So you're going to spawn some in at a certain time, but you want to make sure that, and this is a locality thing, you want to make sure that there's a little line of code at the beginning of that spawn script that says, if this is not a server, don't run this script. So in my last Arma 2 mission, I was supposed to spawn about 120 units at one point. And because this was like what we call battalion scale, so we had over 40 players, it went to spawn 120 units for every player in the game. And
talk about scaling up fast.
Oh God, it's just like everybody starts to get a slideshow. Your frame rate drops to like 1 frame per second and worse. And people are like, what? And I hear people in the radio saying, there's just 1 million guys coming over that hill. And I was like, oh no. I didn't do it again. After 2 years of Arma mission making, actually 3 years at that point, you would think that I would remember to include that line, but yeah, so there's things like that.
I think I was in a rangefinder at the time, and I was probably speechless as to what I was seeing. And as far as the comms, you probably thought it was hyperbole. There's 1 million guys, headed 2 o'clock, this degrees, and you turn and you expect to see some dudes, maybe a technical, pretty heavily up armored, organized group, but instead it was hundreds.
Yeah, it was over 1,000. I think the server admin counted it, and it was, I don't know, 1,200, 1,500. He has pictures. We can get you a picture if you want to include that.
Yeah, I think we'll throw a picture down the bottom.
Okay.
All right. Well, you heard it here. It's okay to make mistakes. Start small. Head into the mission editor. Try some things out. Really explore the game. Once you're ready, get organized. Go through the phase of planning, drafting, and testing. Good luck with all your missions out there. I'd like to thank Lucky for joining me here.
My pleasure.
And if you're interested in getting more episodes, maybe delving deeper into each of the phases, let us know. Otherwise, thanks for listening to GETactics Radio.